Mixing vaporized ozone with alien vomit creates one hell of a scent profile. Designed to break the strongest species in the quadrant, the Galactic Coalition's elite survival course featured acid rain, spine-crushing gravity, and predators that tracked their prey by tasting adrenaline. On day 1, Scott watched a 400-pound reptilian warlord sob for his mother. As for Scott, his biggest grievance was that the local humidity had ruined his bread. To the rest of the universe, this was Deathworld training. To a human, it was the lunch break that broke the galaxy. The drop pod smelled like hot pennies and old sweat. It was a cramped, vibrating metal coffin screaming through the upper atmosphere of a planet the Coalition simply designated as Crucible. Scott sat strapped into the crash seat, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. The harnesses were too small. They were designed for the slender, elegant frames of the core world species, not the broad, dense shoulders of a human. The synthetic webbing dug a painful trench into his collarbone. He shifted his weight, trying to ease the pinch, but the inertia compensators were failing. The pod rattled. Not a gentle hum, but a violent, teeth-rattling shudder that made the back of his eyeballs throb. To his left, Grayson was losing it. Grayson was a heavy worlder, a bipedal wall of gray, chitinous plates and muscle, resembling something between a rhinoceros and a snapping turtle. By all Coalition metrics, Grayson's species were the shock troopers of the galaxy. But right now, Grayson was hyperventilating. His massive chest heaved in shallow, frantic stutters. A thick, ammonia-scented foam bubbled at the edges of his mandibles. "Structural integrity is compromised," Grayson wheezed, the translation collar at his throat rendering his native clicks into a flat, mechanical baritone. "The heat shielding, it's peeling. We are going to burn." "We're not going to burn," Scott said. His voice sounded dry. He swallowed, his throat clicking loudly in his own ears. "It's just turbulence. Breathe through your nose, big guy, assuming you have one under there." Grayson didn't hear him, or didn't care. The alien's claws gouged deep, curling grooves into the armrests of his seat. On Scott's right, Bennett and Fletcher were locked in a silent panic. Bennett, an insectoid scout with iridescent blue plating, had gone completely rigid. The sudden shift in gravity was wreaking havoc on his hemolymph pressure. His multifaceted eyes were dulling from a sharp, vibrant violet to a sickly, milky gray. Fletcher, their squad leader, a tall, lithe mammalian who looked like a hairless feline stretched on a rack, was clutching his restraint strap so hard his knuckles were translucent. Scott let out a slow, measured breath. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a terraforming engineer from the dust bowls of Mars, drafted into this cross-species military exchange program because of a clerical error and a union dispute he was too tired to fight. He was 34, had a bad left knee from a forklift accident, and was running on 4 hours of sleep. He didn't feel fear. He just felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of annoyance. The pod slammed into the atmosphere's lower ceiling. The sound of atmospheric friction went from a roar to a deafening shriek. The temperature inside the cabin spiked. Sweat pricked at Scott's hairline, sliding down his temple and stinging his eye. He blinked it away, wiping his forehead with the back of a thick, calloused thumb. It was hot, probably pushing 45 degrees Celsius. It felt exactly like a July afternoon back in Houston, only with a bit more structural peril. Crunch. The pod hit the dirt. The impact was brutal. The shock absorbers screamed, taking the brunt of the kinetic energy, but enough bled through to compress Scott's spine. His breath left him in a sharp huff. Next to him, Grayson vomited. A splash of glowing blue-green bile splattered against the metal decking. The smell was instant and overpowering, like bleach mixed with rotten fish. Scott gagged, pressing his sleeve over his nose. Ah, man, come on. The explosive bolts on the pod door fired. The heavy metal ramp slammed downward, sinking heavily into the muck outside. Light flooded the cabin, but it wasn't sunlight. It was a sickly, bruised purple glow filtering through a thick canopy of bloated alien flora. "Disembark," Fletcher choked out, his voice trembling. He unlatched his harness and immediately fell to his hands and knees. The gravity was heavy. Coalition specs said it was 1.6 Gs. To the aliens, whose homeworlds hovered around a gentle 0.8 or 0.9, it was like wearing a suit of lead. To Scott, it felt heavy, sure. It felt like walking out of the grocery store with too many bags in both hands, refusing to make 2 trips. His bad knee gave a familiar, dull throb of protest. He unbuckled, standing up slowly. His boots squelched in Grayson's bile. Scott looked down, his lips thinning into a hard line. They were his good boots. Standard issue, sure, but he had broken them in perfectly. "You owe me a cleaning, Grayson," Scott muttered, stepping carefully out of the puddle and walking down the ramp. The air outside was thick enough to chew. It was heavily saturated with moisture and smelled strongly of rotting copper and wet soil. The heat was oppressive, wrapping around Scott like a wet, dirty blanket. He stepped off the ramp, his boots sinking 2 inches into the dark, spongy moss that carpeted the ground. Behind him, his squad was crawling out of the pod. Literally crawling. Fletcher was panting, his thin chest working furiously to pull oxygen from the dense atmosphere. Bennett was limping, 2 of his 6 limbs dragging uselessly behind him as his circulatory system struggled to pump fluid against the crushing gravity. Grayson stumbled out last, leaning heavily against the pod's exterior hull, his gray plates looking dull and ash-like. "This is it," Fletcher whispered, staring into the dense, purple-leafed jungle. "The grinder. Only 20% of candidates survived the first rotation." Scott looked around. The jungle was loud, a cacophony of wet clicks, low hums, and sudden, sharp screeches echoed through the thick trunks of the twisted trees. It was hostile. It was alien. Scott reached into his chest pocket, pulled out a slightly crumpled toothpick, and stuck it between his teeth. "Yeah. Well, better start walking. I want to hit the checkpoint before the sun goes down. Whatever passes for a sun here." He adjusted the heavy survival pack on his shoulders. The straps dug into his collarbone again. He sighed, turning his back on the drop pod and stepping into the brush. Behind him, 3 of the galaxy's most elite warriors looked at the human as if he had just lost his mind. An hour into the trek, the true nature of the grinder made itself known. It wasn't just the gravity or the heat. It was the malicious intent of the environment itself. Everything on this moon seemed perfectly evolved to cause maximum suffering. The ground wasn't solid. Beneath the spongy moss was a layer of thick, viscous mud that seemed to actively grip at their boots. Every step required a conscious, muscular effort to pull free. Schlorp. Step. Schlorp. Step. Scott led the way, relying on a crude compass strapped to his wrist. The magnetic field here was erratic, making standard coalition GPS units useless. They had to rely on basic orienteering, something Scott learned during a miserable summer camp in the Ozarks when he was 12. He was sweating profusely. His standard-issue synthetic weave suit, designed to regulate temperature, was failing miserably. It chafed against his inner thighs with every step. The back of his neck burned where the heavy collar rubbed his skin raw. It was uncomfortable. It was miserable. But it was just that. Discomfort. For the aliens, it was a biological nightmare. "I can't," Bennett chattered. The insectoid was leaning against a thick, fleshy tree trunk. His normally rapid, staccato movements were sluggish. "The atmospheric pressure. It is compressing my spiracles. I am suffocating." Scott stopped, turning around. He wiped his brow, the sweat stinging his eyes. "You're not suffocating, Bennett. You're just out of breath. Pace yourself. Shorter strides." "He is dying, human," Grayson rumbled. The heavy worlder was trailing behind, dragging his feet. Every step he took left a deep, watery crater in the mud. "We are all dying. Our physiological limits have been breached." Scott looked at Grayson. The alien's chitin was covered in a layer of thick, foul-smelling slime. A stress response, Scott assumed. Grayson's eyes, usually a fierce, predatory yellow, were wide and dilated. Fear. Raw, unadulterated, biological panic. Scott felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly smothered by a wave of pure exhaustion. "Nobody's dying. We're just walking. It's just a hike." "A hike into oblivion," Fletcher gasped from somewhere near the rear. The squad leader had given up on walking upright entirely, using his long arms to help pull his body weight along. Snap. The sound was sharp, cutting through the ambient hum of the jungle. Scott froze. He didn't drop into a tactical crouch. He just went perfectly still, tilting his head. He had spent 10 years working on heavy terraforming rigs where a single snapping cable could bisect a man before he heard it. He had learned to listen to the environment. To his right, the vegetation was moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. It was slithering. Thick, purple vines, covered in fine, translucent hairs, were uncoiling from the canopy above. They moved with a jerky, erratic rhythm, drawn toward the heavy scent of ammonia and stress pheromones radiating from Grayson. "Fletcher," Scott said softly, "tell your boys to stop breathing so heavy." "What?" Fletcher wheezed. "The vines! They're tracking the panic sweat." Before Fletcher could translate the order, Grayson let out a low, terrified moan. That was all it took. Like a coiled spring releasing, a vine whipped out from the underbrush. It was thick as a man's forearm, wrapping instantly around Grayson's thick ankle. The bark on the vine was lined with tiny razor-sharp barbs that dug into the alien's chitin. Grayson screamed, a high, piercing whistle that didn't match his massive frame. He fell backward into the mud, his immense weight causing a massive splash. He thrashed, trying to kick the vine away, but his panic only drew more. 3 more vines dropped from the canopy, moving with blinding speed, wrapping around his chest and his other leg. They began to pull, dragging the 400-pound alien toward a massive, pulsing root system at the base of a nearby tree. "Grayson!" Bennett clicked, freezing in place. Fletcher drew his stun baton, but his hand was shaking so badly he dropped it into the mud. Scott sighed, a deep, heavy sigh that rattled in his chest. His knee throbbed. He was so thirsty, his tongue felt like sandpaper. He just wanted to sit down. He unclipped the heavy machete from his belt. It was a primitive tool, entirely out of place in a modern coalition armory, but Scott had insisted on it. Energy weapons ran out of battery. A slab of sharpened steel didn't. He trudged over to Grayson, his boots making that awful slurp sound with every step. The alien was thrashing wildly, screaming about the embrace of the void. "Hold still," Scott muttered, raising the blade. Grayson didn't hold still. A stray kick from the massive alien caught Scott squarely in the shin. Pain blossomed, sharp and hot. Scott grunted, stumbling backward. A flash of genuine anger spiked in his chest. "I said hold still, you big stupid rock!" Scott stepped forward, pinned the main vine to the mud beneath the heel of his boot, and brought the machete down. Thwack! The blade bit through the fibrous tissue easily. Dark, syrupy sap exploded from the wound, smelling strongly of burnt sugar. The severed end of the vine whipped back violently, recoiling into the canopy. Scott didn't hesitate. He swung again and again, hacking through the remaining vines with heavy, unsophisticated chops. He wasn't a swordsman. He was chopping wood. Within seconds, Grayson was free. The remaining vines in the area, sensing the sudden, aggressive violence, retracted slowly into the shadows, shrinking away from the human. Scott stood there, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked at the machete, now covered in purple sap, and wiped it clean on the leg of his already ruined trousers. He looked down at Grayson. The massive alien was hyperventilating, staring up at Scott with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Not of the vines, but of the casual, brutal efficiency the human had just displayed. You severed the neural tendrils of a strangler root," Fletcher whispered, staring at the chopped pieces of vine twitching in the mud. Without hesitation, without fear. "It was grabbing his leg," Scott said, sliding the machete back into its sheath. He bent down, rubbing his shin where Grayson had kicked him. It was definitely going to bruise. "And it was in the way. Come on, get up. We have 2 more clicks to the safe zone." He turned around and started walking again. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He knew they would. They were too terrified not to. As he walked, his stomach let out a long, loud rumble. Scott frowned, pressing a hand against his abdomen. He hadn't eaten since before the drop. He was starving. The beacon was a small, unassuming metal cylinder driven into a rocky outcrop. It pulsed with a faint blue light, projecting an ultrasonic frequency designed to keep the local predatory fauna at bay. This was the rally point, the safe zone. Scott crested the rocky hill and stepped into the perimeter. Instantly, the oppressive hum of the jungle seemed to dial back. The ground here was solid slate, free of the sucking mud. He gunslung his heavy pack and dropped it onto the rock with a dull thud. He stretched his back, grimacing as his vertebrae popped in rapid succession. The heat was still brutal, and the gravity still pulled at his organs, but finally he could stop walking. Behind him, the squad crawled into the clearing. It was a pathetic sight. Fletcher collapsed instantly, curling into a tight ball on the hard rock, his chest heaving. He looked completely broken, his fur matted with sweat and dirt. Bennett had lost all color, his blue plates gray and dull, his mandibles twitching uncontrollably. Grayson stumbled in last. The massive alien didn't even try to sit down carefully. He just let his legs give out, crashing onto the slate with a heavy crack that made Scott wince. Grayson rolled onto his back, staring up at the bruised purple sky. A high-pitched, reedy whistling sound was escaping his respiratory vents. It took Scott a moment to realize the giant reptilian warlord was weeping. "We made it," Fletcher croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "By the ancestors. We survived." "Day 1, Bennett clicked weakly. "We survived day 1. There are 29 rotations left." At that, Grayson sobbed louder. Scott didn't say anything. He was too busy. He sat down on his pack, his knees spread wide, and started digging through the side pouches. His hands were stained with black mud and purple sap. His knuckles scraped and bleeding slightly from the dense underbrush. He ignored the sting. He found what he was looking for, a silver foil packet. Standard issue coalition field rations. They were engineered to provide maximum caloric intake with minimal digestion energy. They tasted like heavily salted cardboard. But right now, Scott didn't care if it tasted like actual dirt. He tore the foil open with his teeth. The sound, a sharp, ripping crackle, was unnaturally loud in the quiet of the safe zone. 3 sets of alien eyes slowly turned towards him. Scott ignored them. He peeled the foil back, revealing a dense, rectangular block of synthetic meat and grains. It looked vaguely like a thick slab of ham jammed between 2 stale crackers. He pulled a small, crushed packet of mustard from his uniform pocket, smuggled from the mess hall on the orbital station, tore it open, and squeezed the yellow paste onto the ration block. The sharp, tangy smell of vinegar and mustard seed hit the heavy air. Scott took a bite. It was dry. It required a lot of chewing. He chewed methodically, staring out at the jungle canopy, his mind entirely blank save for the mechanical process of eating. He swallowed, the dry lump scraping down his throat. He reached for his canteen, took a long pull of warm, metallic-tasting water, and took another massive bite of the ration. What are you doing?" Fletcher asked, his voice cracking. Scott paused mid-chew. He looked at Fletcher, a piece of yellow mustard smeared on the corner of his mouth. "Eating. Eating," Grayson repeated, the translation collar struggling to capture the sheer, unadulterated disbelief in his tone. The heavy worlder pushed himself up onto his elbows. "We have just traversed the valley of death. Our nervous systems are flooded with cortisol. Our bodies are in the final stages of metabolic shock. And you are consuming nutrients?" "Yeah," Scott said, swallowing thickly. "I'm hungry." "How is your digestive tract even functioning?" Bennett asked, pulling his legs tight against his body. In high-stress survival scenarios, the biological imperative is to route all blood flow away from the stomach to the extremities for fight or flight. Eating now should induce violent purging. Scott looked at his half-eaten sandwich. He looked at the aliens. He felt a sudden, profound cultural disconnect. He didn't know how to explain to these elite, highly evolved beings that human bodies were just permanently stressed out, and that eating through the misery was a fundamental coping mechanism. "I guess I'm just used to it," Scott said, taking another bite. He chewed, swallowing before speaking again. "Back home, my shift at the processing plant was 12 hours, 110 degrees on the factory floor, ammonia leaks every other week, and a foreman who yelled at you if you stopped moving. You ate your lunch on the line, usually while dodging sparks from the arc welders. If you waited for a low-stress environment to eat, you starved." He took another drink from his canteen. "This place," Scott gestured to the lethal jungle with his sandwich, "sucks. Don't get me wrong, My knee is killing me. I'm sweating through my boots, and I'm pretty sure that mud gave me a rash. But it's not exactly the end of the world. It's just another Tuesday. And on Tuesday, at noon, I eat lunch." Fletcher stared at him, the squad leader's ears flattened against his skull. "You view this crucible, this apex of evolutionary testing, as a mild workplace inconvenience?" "I view it as a waste of my time," Scott corrected him bluntly. He finished the ration block, crumpling the foil into a small ball and shoving it back into his pocket. "But since I'm stuck here, I might as well stay hydrated." He stood up, groaning as his bad knee popped again. He walked over to Grayson. The massive alien flinched instinctively as the human approached. Scott didn't draw his machete. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another silver foil packet. He tossed it, hitting Grayson square in the chest. "Eat it," Scott ordered. "I cannot," Grayson whispered. "My body will reject it." "Your body is going to shut down if you don't put fuel in it," Scott said, his voice dropping the annoyance, replacing it with a weary, paternal firmness. "Tear it open, eat it slow, drink water. You'll feel like hell, but you won't die." He tossed a packet to Bennett and then one to Fletcher. "Eat," Scott commanded, walking back to his pack and sitting down heavily. "We got 29 days left. I'm not carrying any of you. So eat your damn lunch, take a nap, and we'll figure out how to build a shelter before whatever screams in the dark comes looking for us." The three elite aliens, broken by the environment, sat in stunned silence. Slowly, with trembling hands, Fletcher reached down and picked up the foil packet. Scott didn't watch them. He just leaned back against a rock, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and tried to ignore the chafing in his suit. The bruised purple sky didn't fade into night. It collapsed into it. One moment, the jungle was choked in a hazy violet twilight. And the next, it was like someone had thrown a heavy wool blanket over the entire moon. The transition took less than 10 minutes. With the darkness came a sudden, plunging drop in temperature. The oppressive wet heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a damp, bone-sapping chill that settled instantly into Scott's bad knee. The ultrasonic beacon in the center of their camp glowed with a faint blue rhythm. It was supposed to be a psychological comfort as much as a physical deterrent. It wasn't working for anyone. Scott sat on a flat slate rock, his heavy jacket zipped to his chin. He watched the shadows stretch and merge. The jungle beyond their small, rocky clearing had changed its tune. The daytime clicks and screeches were gone, replaced by low, resonant thrums that felt more like vibrations in the teeth than actual sounds. Something massive dragged itself through the mud a quarter-mile out, the wet slop, slop, slop echoing through the dense trunks. He looked at his squad. They were worse than useless. Grayson was curled into a massive chitinous boulder near the beacon. He had tucked his head beneath his thick arms, instinctively protecting his vulnerable throat. The heavy worlder was shivering, his armored plates clicking faintly against one another like castanets. Bennett, the insectoid, was completely rigid, suspended in a state of torpor induced by the sudden cold. His 6 limbs were tucked tightly against his thorax, his multifaceted eyes dull and lifeless. Fletcher was awake, but barely. The feline mammal sat with his back pressed against a rock, his knees drawn to his chest, staring blankly into the pitch-black tree line. He held his stun baton loosely in one hand, but his grip was weak. If a stiff breeze hit him, he'd drop it. "Fletcher," Scott said. His voice was a low rasp in the quiet clearing. Fletcher flinched, his ears swiveling frantically. "Yes? What? Is it a perimeter breach?" "No," Scott said, standing up. His knee gave a sharp, grinding pop. He grimaced, massaging the joint through his thick pants. "It's freezing, and it's only going to get colder. We need a fire." Fletcher stared at him, his large, glowing yellow eyes blinking in confusion. "A fire? An uncontrolled exothermic reaction? Human, that is a violation of basic stealth protocols. We will broadcast our thermal signature to every apex predator within a 10-click radius." "The beacon already does that," Scott muttered, walking past the squad leader toward the edge of the clearing. "It puts out a sonic wall, sure, but whatever is hungry enough and deaf enough to push through it isn't going to care if we're hiding in the dark. Besides, Bennett is going into thermal shock. If we don't warm him up, you're going to be dragging 150 pounds of dead bug tomorrow." Scott didn't wait for permission. He stepped just past the edge of the slate, keeping one foot in the safe zone, and began gathering debris. The vegetation here was damp, but he had spent enough time on backwater terraforming colonies to know what burned. He looked for the sap-heavy vines, the dead ones that had turned gray and brittle. He gathered armfuls of it, dragging it back to the center of the camp. Fletcher watched him with a mixture of horror and exhausted apathy. Scott piled the kindling into a rough pyramid. He didn't have matches or a flint. He dug into his heavy tool belt, the one the coalition quartermaster had tried to confiscate until Scott threatened a Union walkout, and pulled out a compact plasma torch. It was designed for fusing atmospheric pressure valves, not camping. He flicked the ignition. A needle-thin jet of blinding blue plasma hissed to life, smelling instantly of ozone. Grayson let out a muffled whimper, pressing tighter into his ball. Scott touched the plasma to the pile of sap-heavy vines. The reaction was instantaneous. The purple sap didn't just catch, it flared. A bright, crackling orange flame erupted, consuming the dry husks and sending a thick column of sweet-smelling white smoke into the air. Scott clicked the torch off and holstered it. He sat back down on his rock, holding his hands out toward the flames. The heat was immediate. It was a harsh, uneven warmth, but it felt like absolute heaven against his chilled skin. Slowly, the aliens reacted. Fletcher uncurled his legs, leaning forward. The feline's pupils were blown wide, tracking the dancing sparks. He didn't speak, but he dragged himself a foot closer to the hearth. A few minutes later, Bennett stirred. The radiant heat began to thaw the insectoid's hemolymph. His mandibles twitched, and his dull eyes slowly regained their violet hue. He unspooled his limbs with a series of sickening cracks, dragging his thorax closer to the fire. Even Grayson uncurled slightly, turning his broad, armored back toward the flames to soak in the thermal energy. "It violates protocol," Fletcher whispered again, though he was holding his long, clawed hands out to the fire, just as Scott was. "Protocol assumes you're fighting an enemy army," Scott said, pulling his hat down low over his eyes to block the glare. "We aren't. We're fighting the dirt. The dirt doesn't care about your thermal signature. The dirt just wants you cold and dead." "Get some sleep, Commander. I'll take first watch." Fletcher looked like he wanted to argue, but the sheer exhaustion painted across his gaunt face won out. He curled up on the slate, wrapping his tail around his nose, and closed his eyes. Scott sat alone, watching the flames. He listened to the wet, heavy sounds of the alien jungle. He thought about his apartment on Mars. It was cramped, smelled like recycled air and stale beer, and the plumbing rattled when the neighbor showered. Right now, he would have traded a decade of his life to be sitting on that lumpy couch. He sighed, tossing another brittle vine into the fire. It was going to be a long night. It happened at 0300 hours. Scott was still awake. He had tried to wake Grayson for the second watch, but the heavy worlder was locked in a deep, stress-induced coma, entirely unresponsive to Scott kicking his boots. Rather than deal with the bureaucratic headache of a dead squad, Scott just brewed a thermos of synthetic stimcaf and powered through. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing, pulsing embers that cast long, unnatural shadows across the slate. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound. It was a smell. Scott was chewing on his third toothpick of the night when the scent hit him. It punched through the sweet, sugary smell of the burning sap. It was acrid, sharp, and deeply wrong. It smelled like a mixture of ruptured batteries, rotting meat, and rust. Scott stopped chewing. He didn't move his head, but his eyes darted to the perimeter. The ultrasonic beacon was still pulsing its calming blue light. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Then the light flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, a shadow, massive and misshapen, had passed between the beacon and the embers. Scott slowly reached down. He bypassed the machete on his hip. Whatever was out there was big enough to block the light of the beacon entirely. A blade wasn't going to cut it. He unclasped the heavy flap of his secondary holster and wrapped his hand around the grip of his flare gun. It was a Mark IV industrial signaling pistol, designed to shoot a magnesium phosphorus charge through low-orbit cloud cover. It was heavy, bulky, and entirely lethal at close range. Crunch. A heavy-clawed foot stepped onto the slate rock of the safe zone. The ultrasonic beacon didn't even slow it down. Scott stood up. His knee screamed in protest, but adrenaline washed the pain away, replacing it with a cold, hollow focus. The creature stepped into the dim red light of the embers. It was a nightmare of convergent evolution. It possessed the hunched muscular build of a silverback gorilla, but its skin was a mottled, translucent gray, stretched tight over dense, shifting muscle fibers. It had no eyes. Instead, its head was a flat, wedge-shaped dome covered in deep sensory pits that constantly expanded and contracted, tasting the thermal currents in the air. Its jaws unhinged, dropping open to reveal rows of jagged glass-like teeth dripping with thick, black saliva. It was tracking the heat of the fire and the heat of the squad. Fletcher woke up. The squad leader's eyes snapped open, locking onto the beast. He didn't shout. He didn't issue an order. He simply froze, his vocal cords paralyzed by a primal, overriding terror. Bennett and Grayson remained asleep, blissfully ignorant of the apex predator standing 10 feet away. The creature turned its eyeless, pitted wedge of a head toward Fletcher. It let out a sound, not a roar, but a high-frequency clicking that rattled the fillings in Scott's teeth. It coiled its massive, trunk-like legs, preparing to lunge at the paralyzed feline. Scott didn't shout a battle cry. He didn't try to distract it with a rock. He just raised the heavy flare gun, leveled it at the center of the creature's broad gray chest, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was brutal. It kicked back like a mule, snapping Scott's wrist backward and throwing him off balance. He fell hard, his tailbone slamming into the slate rock. The gun barked with a deafening crack, launching the magnesium charge. At a distance of 10 feet, the flare didn't have time to arc. It hit the creature dead in the sternum and ignited. The clearing exploded in blinding magnesium-white light. The heat was instantaneous, washing over the camp like the open door of a blast furnace. The creature shrieked, a horrifying metallic screech of pure agony. The phosphorus charge burned at nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't just burn the creature's flesh, it melted right through the dense muscle and bone. The monster thrashed backward, tearing up chunks of moss and mud in its frenzy. It slammed into a thick tree trunk, the burning flare still lodged in its chest cavity, illuminating its internal organs like a grotesque jack-o'-lantern. It took 3 more agonizing, thrashing steps into the jungle before its nervous system finally failed. It collapsed into the mud, the flare sputtering and hissing as it boiled the creature from the inside out. The white light slowly faded, replaced once again by the dim red glow of the embers. The smell of rotting meat was entirely overpowered by the stench of scorched ozone and burnt flesh. Scott lay on the rock, staring up at the pitch-black sky. His right wrist was throbbing with a dull, sickening heat. He was pretty sure he had sprained it. His ears were ringing violently, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the background hum of the jungle. He rolled over onto his side, groaning heavily, and pushed himself up with his good hand. The squad was awake now. Grayson, Bennett, and Fletcher were all sitting upright, staring at the smoking, glowing corpse a few yards into the tree line. Then slowly, in unison, they turned their heads to look at Scott. Scott sat up, brushing slate dust off his pants. He holstered the empty flare gun, wincing as his sprained wrist protested the movement. He looked at the 3 aliens staring at him with a mixture of absolute terror and religious awe. "What?" Scott snapped, his voice loud over the ringing in his ears. "You," Fletcher stammered, his fur standing perfectly on end. "You carried a micro-munitions thermal lance into a survival scenario." "It's a flare gun," Scott grumbled, rubbing his temple. He was exhausted, he was in pain, and he was incredibly irritated. "It's standard issue in my Union toolkit. God, it stinks now. Try to go back to sleep. The smell of that thing cooking is going to keep everything else away for miles." He turned away from them, walking back over to his rock. He sat down, pulled out his thermos, and poured himself another cup of tepid, bitter coffee. He didn't look back at the creature. He didn't look at the squad. He just stared into the glowing embers, plotting exactly how many grievances he was going to file with human resources if he ever got off this rock. Dawn on the Crucible was less of a sunrise and more of a slow, creeping dilution of the darkness. The sky transitioned from pitch black to a bruised, sickly gray. A heavy, wet fog had rolled in off the mudflats during the early hours, clinging to the ground and reducing visibility to less than 30 feet. Scott was awake. He hadn't slept a wink. He sat on his rock, a crumpled foil packet of synthetic protein powder in his left hand, and his canteen in his right. He was using his teeth to tear the packet open because his right wrist was swollen to the size of a baseball. It throbbed with a slow, hot rhythm. He managed to rip the foil, pouring the chalky brown powder into the canteen and shaking it awkwardly. It was breakfast. It tasted like sawdust mixed with old pennies. He drank it anyway. Across the dead campfire, the squad was engaged in a hushed, intense conversation. They were speaking in their native tongues, relying on the translation collars to bridge the gap, but they were keeping their voices deliberately low. Scott couldn't hear the exact words, but he caught the tone. It was the tone mechanics used when discussing a machine they didn't understand, but were terrified of breaking. Every few seconds, one of them would glance over at him, then quickly look away. Scott sighed, lowering his canteen. "Look, if you have something to say, just say it. The whispering is giving me a headache." The three aliens froze. They exchanged a look, and then Fletcher stood up. The feline squad leader walked over, his posture completely different from the day before. The haughty, elite military bearing was gone. He walked with his head slightly lowered, his ears flat, and his tail tucked low. It was a posture of absolute submission. "Engineer Scott," Fletcher said. His voice was careful, precise. "Just Scott," he corrected, taking another sip of his awful protein shake. "Scott," Fletcher amended. He gestured nervously toward the tree line, where the scorched, hollowed-out carcass of the predator was barely visible through the thick fog. Small, scavenger-like insects were already swarming it, buzzing loudly. Bennett has analyzed the biological remnants of the aggressor. It was a local apex variant, heavily armored, blind but sensitive to thermal and auditory shifts. Standard energy weapons would have been completely ineffective against its subdermal plating. "Neat," Scott said flatly. "You anticipated this," Fletcher said, taking a step closer. "You understood that our standard issue coalition armaments were insufficient. You bypassed military regulation to bring a high-yield industrial thermal weapon. You baited the creature with the fire, knowing the ultrasonic beacon would fail, and executed it at point-blank range to ensure maximum kinetic and thermal transfer." Scott stopped chewing his protein slurry. He stared at Fletcher. The alien's eyes were wide, glowing with a bizarre reverence. Behind him, Grayson and Bennett were nodding in solemn agreement. They had spent the last 2 hours analyzing the encounter, applying elite tactical frameworks to what was, essentially, a construction worker panicking and shooting a flare gun at a monster. "You are a tactical savant," Grayson rumbled from the back, his heavy plates shifting as he bowed his head slightly. "Your species pretends to be laborers, simple terraformers. But this was the work of a master of the hunt. You lured it. You destroyed it." Scott rubbed his face with his good hand. He could feel the stubble rough against his palm. He was so tired. He looked at Fletcher, at the absolute certainty in the alien's eyes, and realized something horrible. They didn't just respect him now. They were looking to him to keep them alive. They had transferred the burden of leadership onto his shoulders, validating it with a completely fabricated tactical genius. Scott wanted to tell them the truth. He wanted to tell them he built the fire because his knee hurt and he was cold. He wanted to tell them he used the flare gun because he was too lazy to clean the machete, and it was the biggest thing on his belt. He wanted to tell them he fell on his ass and sprained his wrist because he forgot how hard the Mark IV kicked. He opened his mouth to shatter their illusion, but then he looked at Grayson. The heavy worlder was standing up straight for the first time since the drop. The crushing fear that had paralyzed him yesterday was gone, replaced by a grim, steady resolve. Bennett was double-checking his environmental seals, his movements crisp and precise again. Fletcher was waiting for orders. The lie, Scott realized, was the only thing keeping them functional. If they thought he was a bumbling, exhausted engineer who just got lucky, the existential dread of the grinder would break them again. If they thought he was an apex predator who casually baited monsters for fun, they might just survive the week. Scott closed his mouth. He swallowed the bitter truth along with the last of his protein shake. "Yeah," Scott lied smoothly, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He stood up, intentionally ignoring the spike of pain in his knee and wrist. He looked Fletcher dead in the eye. "I baited it. Coalition weapons are garbage on a rock like this. You need raw heat and heavy mass to punch through this ecosystem." Fletcher nodded rapidly, his ears twitching. "Brilliant. Brutal, but brilliant." "Grab your gear," Scott ordered, pointing his good hand at the foggy jungle. "The smell of that thing is going to attract scavengers, big ones. We need to move. 5 clicks north to the next beacon. We maintain a tight formation. Grayson, you take the rear. Bennett, you track the mud depth. Fletcher, you walk point with me." "Yes, sir," Fletcher said, the military discipline snapping instantly back into place. Scott turned away, slinging his heavy survival pack over his left shoulder to spare his bad wrist. He adjusted the straps, feeling the familiar, annoying pinch against his collarbone. He looked out into the thick gray fog, listening to the ominous, wet sounds of a planet actively trying to kill them. He took a deep breath, the damp metallic air filling his lungs. "All right, boys," Scott muttered, stepping off the slate rock and into the mud with a wet schlorp. "Let's go clock in." The jungle didn't offer paths. It only offered varying degrees of resistance. By day 7, that resistance took the form of a slow-moving, 100-foot-wide river of pale, yellowish sludge. Scott stood at the bank, his boots sinking into the spongy gray moss. The smell hit him instantly, like a ruptured car battery left to bake in a sealed garage. A sharp, metallic tang coated the back of his throat, making his eyes water and his gums ache. The river oozed rather than flowed. Thick bubbles rose through the viscous fluid, breaching the surface with a heavy, wet glop, releasing warm puffs of sulfurous gas into the suffocating humidity. "It is highly alkaline," Bennett clicked. The insectoid crouched at the water's edge, holding a cracked diagnostic scanner over the surface. The plastic casing softened visibly under the ambient fumes. "The pH level is staggering. Immersion will result in the rapid dissolution of organic tissue. Our boots will melt in approximately 4 minutes." Scott sighed, a ragged, wet sound catching in his dry throat. His right wrist, swollen from the flare gun recoil days ago, was bound tightly in strips of his undershirt. The joint throbbed with a dull, relentless fire. His left knee felt like it was packed with broken glass. He was exhausted, running on a calorie deficit that made the edges of his vision pulse black in time with his erratic heartbeat. "Can we go around?" Grayson asked. The heavy worlder leaned his massive frame against a decaying tree trunk, his thick plates scored and scratched from a week of razor-sharp underbrush. "We lack the caloric reserves," Fletcher said, his feline face gaunt, his fur matted with dried mud. "The extraction beacon is 12 clicks due north. If we deviate, we starve before we reach the coordinates." Inevitably, 3 pairs of alien eyes turned to Scott. They didn't move without looking to the human, assuming he was constantly calculating complex tactical variables through a predator's mind. In reality, Scott was just trying to remember how he and the boys used to seal caustic runoff pipes back on the Europa terraforming rigs. "It's not a deep river," Scott muttered. He tossed a dense rock into the yellow sludge. It sank slowly, hitting bottom with a dull, echoing thud barely 2 feet down. "Depth is irrelevant if it melts our feet, human," Fletcher pointed out nervously. "It's viscous," Scott said, squinting. "Heavy particulate. That means the bottom isn't mud. The alkaline salts precipitate out to form a hard crust on the riverbed. It's solid, like concrete." "Scott, please," Bennett chattered, mandibles vibrating with anxiety. "The structural integrity of our footwear—" "You said 4 minutes," Scott interrupted, looking at the insectoid with bloodshot, bruised eyes. "The crossing is 100 feet. Even at a slow wade, that's 2 minutes, 2.5 if the current pushes." "You intend to walk through it," Grayson stated reverently. "I intend to walk fast," Scott corrected. He adjusted his heavy pack, riding it high on his shoulders to spare his bad wrist, and stepped off the bank. The moment his boots broke the surface, an aggressive hissing filled the air. Shh! The heat was instantaneous, a sharp, biting chemical burn transferring straight through the thick rubber soles. It felt exactly like standing barefoot on a hot skillet. Scott gritted his teeth, his jaw locking so tight a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He drove his legs forward. Push, drag, push, drag. The slurry pulled at his shins, heavy and dense as wet cement. "Do not stop moving," Scott barked over the hesitant splashes behind him. "Keep your knees high." The heat crawled up his calves. The outer layer of his pants began to smoke, synthetic fibers dissolving into sticky black strings. Splash, splash, thud. A heavy, terrified gurgle echoed behind him. Scott snapped his head around. Grayson had fallen. The heavy worlder's massive foot had punched through a thin spot in the riverbed's crust, sinking him up to his thick thigh. Grayson thrashed, plunging his armored plates into the caustic acid. His translation collar shrieked as the sludge ate into the softer, exposed tissue beneath his chitin. Fletcher and Bennett froze, paralyzed as their own feet smoked. "Damn it," Scott hissed. He didn't weigh tactical advantages. He just saw a guy on his crew going under. Scott fought the heavy current, lunging back. He reached Grayson, ignoring the burning sludge splashing up to his waist, and grabbed the thick synthetic webbing of Grayson's harness with his good left hand. "Plant your good foot!" Scott roared. Grayson couldn't hear him. Scott had no choice. He brought his right hand up, the sprained, taped-up, agonizing right wrist, and grabbed the harness too. He planted his boots on the solid crust, took a deep, sulfur-filled breath, and pulled. The pain was transcendent. A blinding electric shock arced from his wrist straight into his neck. White spots exploded across his vision, but the suction broke with a sickening plop. Grayson tumbled forward. Scott let go instantly, stumbling backward onto the soft, muddy incline of the opposite bank. He dragged himself out of the fluid, coughing violently. The squad collapsed onto the mud behind him, their gear hissing as residual acid ate at the fabric. Scott lay on his back, staring up at the bruised sky. His right arm was entirely numb, a terrifying sign of structural joint damage. His boots were half melted, the rubber warped and permanently fused to his pants. His skin burned everywhere the acid had touched. Fletcher stared at him, glowing eyes wide with horror and awe. "You pulled him out," He outweighs you by a factor of 2. The biomechanical leverage required. You tore your own muscle fibers to extract him. Scott closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the damp mud. He forced himself up into a sitting position, using only his left arm, wedging a damp toothpick between his teeth. "He was holding up the line," Scott rasped, his voice dangerously flat. "Check your boots. We've got 10 clicks left, and I want to clock out." Day 22. The Crucible didn't just break its candidates. It ground them into a fine, miserable paste. They huddled in a shallow slate alcove while a torrential downpour turned the jungle outside into a roaring, impassable waterfall. The rain wasn't just water. It was heavy, highly acidic condensation that pelted the mud with the relentless, percussive sound of millions of dropping ball bearings. Inside the cave, the air was thick and suffocating. It smelled exactly like a factory locker room at the end of a double shift. A pungent, deeply human cocktail of stale sweat, oxidized adrenaline, and the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed hair. Scott sat with his back pressed against the cold, jagged rock. His injured right arm was bound tight to his chest in a makeshift sling ripped from his own undershirt, smelling faintly of sulfur and dried blood. He hadn't shaved in 3 weeks. The patchy beard on his jaw itched with a maddening, humid intensity that he tried desperately to ignore. Across the small plasma torch fire, the alien sat in the dim blue light. The Coalition's finest had degraded, their pristine military conditioning entirely stripped away, but they hadn't broken. Instead, they had adapted. They adapted by mimicking the one thing keeping them alive. It was deeply, viscerally unsettling. Fletcher, the aristocratic feline commander, no longer sat with upright military rigidity. He was slouched against the cave wall, one knee drawn up to his chest, arms draped loosely over it. A small, chewed-up twig hung lazily from the corner of his mouth. Bennett was methodically scraping the mud from his mandibles with a flat stone, perfectly mirroring Scott's nightly machete maintenance. Grayson, the 400-pound warlord, sat hunched with a heavy 1,000-yard stare, having silently taken over, carrying Scott's heavy survival pack. They were mirroring a tired, broken-down pipe fitter from Mars, treating his depressed, blue-collar coping mechanisms as if they were elite tactical doctrines. The Coalition rations had run out 2 days ago. Now, they were eating the dirt. Scott sat forward, his fractured ribs grinding in protest, and held a sharpened stick over the blue plasma flame. Skewered on the end was a local grub the size of a football, a bloated gray cross between a centipede and a slug. As the intense heat hit the carapace, thick yellow fat bubbled to the surface. It dripped into the fire with loud, aggressive hisses, sending up plumes of acrid smoke that smelled intensely of burning tires and rancid shrimp. Scott's stomach let out a hollow, painful cramp. He pulled the skewer back, drew his machete awkwardly with his left hand, and sawed the charred mass into 4 uneven chunks. He tossed them out. Grayson caught his and devoured it in 2 bites, shell and all. Fletcher held the steaming gray meat, his glowing yellow eyes fixed on the fire. He took a bite. A loud crunch echoed off the cave walls, followed by a wet squelch. "Protein," Fletcher muttered, his voice a perfect gravelly imitation of Scott's weary pragmatism. "Fuel for the furnace." Scott took a bite of his own piece. The exterior was crunchy, like burnt popcorn, but the inside was a warm, gelatinous paste that tasted purely of ammonia and raw iron. He suppressed a gag, swallowed it whole, and chased it with warm metallic water from his canteen. "Scott," Grayson rumbled, his deep voice softened by the ambient roar of the storm. "You have guided us through the abyss. Your tactical knowledge of hostile environments is unparalleled. Where did you receive your conditioning? Was it the orbital drop shock academies of Terra?" Scott stopped chewing. The firelight flickered across their battered, expectant faces. They were looking at him with absolute reverence. The illusion was still holding. Suddenly, the lie felt heavier than 1.6 gravity. He was just so damn tired. The ache in his bones made the mask suffocating. He wiped the rancid grease off his chin with the back of his dirty hand. "I didn't go to an academy," Scott said softly, the words cutting easily through the background roar of the rain. "I told you on day one, I'm a terraforming engineer. I lay pipes. I weld pressure valves." Bennett clicked knowingly, tapping his temple. "A cover story, standard operative procedure." "No," Scott laughed, a short, bitter sound that quickly turned into a wet cough. "No cover story. My commanding officer was a guy named Big Mike. He weighed 300 pounds, drank cheap whiskey out of a ceramic coffee mug, and had half a mechanical lung from breathing silica dust. He wasn't a general. He was an asshole foreman who fired you if you stopped working." The alien stared at him. The translation collars hummed, struggling to process the profound lack of military pedigree. "The fire on the first night?" Scott whispered, staring into the blue flame. "I built it because my bad knee hurt and I was freezing. I shot that predator with a flare because it was the only thing I could reach, and I was terrified. I walked through that acid river because I was too exhausted to find a detour. I'm not a soldier, Commander. I'm just a guy used to working terrible jobs in terrible conditions for terrible pay. This planet is just another bad shift." Silence fell over the alcove. Scott waited for the panic. He waited for their morale to shatter, for the realization that their tactical genius was a fraud to finally break them. Fletcher stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. Then the feline slowly reached up, adjusted the twig in his mouth, and leaned forward into the firelight. "To endure such biological agony without the conditioning of a soldier," Fletcher whispered, his voice thick with a new, terrifying kind of awe. "To face the abyss not with military doctrine, but with the sheer, unbroken will of a laborer. That is not a cover story, Scott. That is mythic." Grayson nodded slowly, his heavy plates shifting in the dim light. "The warlord Big Mike forged a hardened warrior. We are honored to serve on your shift." Scott just stared at them. He had handed them the pathetic truth, and they had somehow weaponized it into a deeper, stronger religion. He let out a long, exhausted breath. He reached out and grabbed another piece of the foul meat. "All right," Scott muttered, staring at the cave floor. "Whatever gets you through the night, eat up. We push for the extraction zone at first light." Day 30. The extraction zone was a flat, barren plateau at the top of a steep, jagged ridgeline. Of course it was. The coalition wouldn't make it easy. The storm that had started on day 28 hadn't stopped. It had intensified. The sky was a swirling, angry vortex of black and bruised purple clouds. The rain was falling so hard it felt like being sprayed with a high-pressure hose. The steep incline leading up to the plateau had turned into a vertical slip and slide of deep, churning gray mud. Scott was at the back of the line now. He had nothing left. His right arm was strapped tightly to his chest, entirely useless. His left knee was locked, every step requiring him to swing his entire hip forward just to advance. He was pale, his lips tinged blue from the cold, shivering violently under his soaked, ruined jacket. He was running entirely on spite. Ahead of him, the squad was fighting the mud. Bennett was leading, using his remaining 5 limbs to anchor himself into the rocky outcroppings beneath the sludge, finding the secure handholds. Grayson was right behind him, using his massive bulk to block the worst of the mudslides from hitting the rest of the team. Fletcher was beside Scott. The sleek, aristocratic feline from day one was gone. Fletcher was covered in mud, his claws gouging deep into the earth, hauling himself upward. Every few steps, Fletcher would pause, reach back, and grab the webbing of Scott's harness, helping to pull the exhausted human up the incline. It was a complete reversal. The aliens were dragging him across the finish line. "Keep moving!" Fletcher roared over the deafening sound of the wind. "The beacon is active. The dropship is descending." Scott couldn't look up. The rain was blinding. He kept his eyes locked on Fletcher's muddy boots, forcing his uncooperative legs to move. Push, drag, push, drag. His heart felt like a dying engine, misfiring in his chest. He tasted copper and bile in the back of his throat. Almost there. 10 feet. 5 feet. With a final agonizing heave, Grayson reached the top of the plateau. The heavy worlder reached down, grabbed Fletcher and Scott by their harnesses, and hoisted them up over the lip of the ridge. They collapsed onto the flat, hard slate of the extraction zone. Above them, the roaring storm was suddenly cut by a high-pitched, whining hum. The clouds parted slightly as a coalition dropship descended. It was a beautiful, sleek wedge of pristine white metal and glowing blue thrusters. It hovered over the plateau, its repulsor lifts pushing the heavy rain away in a perfect dry dome. The landing gear deployed with a smooth mechanical clunk, and the ship settled onto the rock. The boarding ramp lowered slowly. A brilliant, sterile white light flooded out from the interior, illuminating the 4 wretched, filthy creatures lying on the slate. At the top of the ramp stood a coalition extraction officer. He was an avian species, tall and impossibly elegant, wearing a perfectly pressed, spotless white uniform adorned with gold commendation medals. He held a sleek, transparent data pad in one manicured wing. The officer looked down at the squad, his beak wrinkled in overt, undeniable disgust. The smell radiating from Scott and the aliens, a month's worth of sulfur, ammonia, burnt fat, and rotting vegetation, was pungent enough to cut through the smell of the ozone. "Extraction team localized," the officer announced, his voice crisp and artificially amplified over the storm. "Identify yourselves." Fletcher pushed himself up onto his knees. He didn't salute. He just stared at the clean, perfect officer with eyes that had seen the dark, hungry belly of the planet. "Squad 7, Fletcher rasped, his voice raw. "Candidates Grayson, Bennett, and Fletcher." The officer tapped his data pad. "Noted. And the 4th? Scott didn't wait for an introduction. He didn't ask for help. He grabbed the side of the ramp with his good left hand and hauled himself upright. His joints popped audibly. He looked like a corpse dragged from a swamp. His clothes were shredded, his face hidden behind a matted, filthy beard, his arm bound to his chest with rotting fabric. He walked up the ramp. He didn't limp. He dragged his leg, leaving a thick black smear of toxic mud across the pristine glowing white floorboards of the dropship. The officer stepped back, holding a wing over his beak. "Halt! You are contaminating the sterile zone. You must undergo decontamination protocols before entering the main..." Scott didn't stop. He walked right past the officer, his shoulder checking the avian slightly, pushing him aside. "Human!" the officer squawked, offended. "What is your designation? What are you doing?" Scott stopped halfway down the pristine white hallway. He turned his head slowly, looking over his shoulder. His eyes were dead, hollow, and utterly devoid of military respect. He looked past the officer, looking at Grayson, Bennett, and Fletcher, who were now walking up the ramp, leaving their own trails of filth. Scott looked back at the terrified officer. "My designation is Scott," he growled, the gravelly sound echoing in the clean, sterile hallway. "My shift is over. I want a hot shower. I want a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread. And if you say the word protocol to me again, I'm going to throw you out the airlock." The officer froze, his feathers puffing out in shock. Scott didn't wait for a response. He turned and kept walking down the hall, trailing mud with every step. Behind him, the three deadliest, most elite warriors in the coalition followed in perfect, silent unison, walking exactly where the human walked. They had survived the crucible. They had survived the grinder. But mostly, they had survived the management. And now, it was time for lunch. For viewers who enjoyed seeing Scott turn a galactic Deathworld into just another miserable Tuesday on the job, smashing that like button shows some true blue-collar solidarity. Subscribing and ringing the bell ensures audiences never miss another HFY tale where human stubbornness outshines elite alien training. Sharing this video with a friend who hates their boss is highly encouraged, and viewers can drop a comment down below. What is the first meal a person would demand after 30 days in the mud? The next story awaits.